when it comes to managing your users as far as security and rights are concerned, one of the most important fundamentals that we need to understand is the concept of groups. Groups is not a new concept. This again has been in the Microsoft environment since the early days of centralizing or their networking services. And ADDS, which came out in the year 2000, has pretty much always had groups, and they've had different types of groups as well as what are called different scopes of groups. And so I want to give you an understanding of what all that exactly entails. All right. So just to begin here, what we'll talk about is just the fact that when you look at groups, when you create groups, you have what is called a group type, and you have what is called a group scope. Okay, so you have group type, and you have what's called group scope. Now, the group types, you have what is known as a distribution group, and you have what is known as a security group. Okay, and so the thing you want to pretty much remember about a distribution group is purely for email purposes. It's essentially just an email list. And if you've got Microsoft Exchange, if you create a group and with Microsoft Exchange, it'll be a distribution group. Essentially what will end up happening is if the distribution group gets an email address. So for example, if I had a group called sales, you would have a name like sales@examlabpractice.com. And if somebody emailed that group, the email would go to everybody in the group. The problem with distribution groups is you can't give them any permissions to anything. They can purely just be used for email. So you're not really going to use distribution groups a whole lot, probably. Most people don't because people use security groups. With security groups, you can use these for permissions and email. A lot of people don't realize that, but security groups can basically do both. Okay, they can be given rights to both. All right, so basically you can associate permissions with them as well as you can associate an email account with them. All right. So as far as group type goes, that's pretty straightforward. Things can get a little crazy when you start trying to understand, though, something called group scope. So let's talk about group scope. Now there's three group scopes. We have something called a domain local group. Well, we'll start with global, actually. We'll start with global. Then you have something called a domain local group, and then you have something called a universal group. Okay, so let's kind of spend a little bit of time on global groups, domain local groups, and universal groups. So the rule of thumb here is that you usually are going to want to group your users together inside of a domain using what is called a global group. Global groups are used for grouping your users together. So, and you'll probably group them together. Probably one of the most common ways you're going to group them is based on departments. Though you can base it on other things. You can base it on management level. You could base it on a security clearance. I mean, you can base it on a lot of things. But department, I would say, is probably one of the most common ways of doing it. So just to kind of visualize this a little bit, we got a global group here. All right. And so I might have a global group called, I'll call it maybe New York sales, because that's another thing people will do is if they've got like a sales department in their different offices, maybe you've got a sales department that's located in New York, you've got one in Dallas, you've got one in Birmingham, you've got them in the different sites. You might name the group based on the location of where that group is. Okay. And so then I might have, again, I might have Dallas sales. All right. And then I might have, I'm just going to say Birm sales, and that's going to be short for Birmingham, just so I don't have to take up a lot of space with that. So then you might have three global groups with your different users in each of those containers. All right, so for example, let's just create the symbol of a user. All right, my usual little smiley face person here with the goofy looking smile. All right. And what we're also going to do is to kind of indicate that there are multiple users. We'll do this right here. Okay. And part of the logic here, so you're going to put your users in those. You're going to put your user objects inside those containers to group them together for permissions. All right. This is not to be confused with OUs, because OUs are going to be used to simply visually separate things. And we know that objects can only be inside of a single OU, whereas with groups, users can actually be in multiple groups at a time. The other thing that's different between an OU and a group is if you put users in an OU, an organizational unit, you delete the OU, the users are gone because it's a real container. Groups are not really a container. You are really linking things to a group. You could put users in a group, you can delete the group, and it does not delete the users that are inside the group. That's the thing to remember, okay? So this is the common way that people do it. They'll create global groups, they'll put their users in global groups. Now the other thing about global groups is that global groups they can only contain users that are from the domain where they're created, but they can be given rights to other domains. For example, here we've got a little triangle symbol that's going to represent a domain, and then from here maybe you've got like a child domain or something like that. Okay, we'll just call this domain A and domain B just to give it something quick. And if I want, I can take this global group, for example. This global group could be applied here in the domain A, and because of this trust relationship, believe it or not, not only could I give rights out to this global group in domain A, but global group can be given rights out to stuff over in domain B as well. Okay, global groups, the little saying I would always like to tell students is that global groups can travel the globe. Though they can only contain user accounts from the domain where they are created, they can be given rights to other domains as well. Okay, now I also want to let you in on another little secret that Microsoft likes people to be aware of, and that is you want to minimize the amount of objects that are given permissions based on an access control list. So here's what I mean by that. Servers, like this guy right here, have something called an ACL, an access control list. Access control lists are permissions list where you're going to give permissions out to some kind of a resource. And so there is something that can sometimes become a little bit of a headache as far as Active Directory goes, and that's known as what are called SID lookups. So what is a SID? A SID is an identifier that every object gets in Active Directory. It's a number that every object gets inside of Active Directory and identifies each object, user accounts, groups, anything that can be given permissions to something gets this SID. And with the domain, there's a thing called a relative ID, but I'm not getting into all that right now. Ultimately, though, everything gets a SID number. Now, these access control lists, they have permissions that are given to these objects based on their SID. And the more objects you have on an ACL, the more what are known as SID lookups that has to happen. That means that when somebody goes to a server and you're dealing with permissions, it's got to do what's called a SID lookup to find out what permissions are supposed to be given to a certain user. So we want to minimize the entries that are on an access control list. Okay, so one of the things that Microsoft recommends is that you consider how many entries are located on an access control list. Okay, so for example, if I have 3 different global groups, I could assign the permissions to these 3 different groups directly, and then I've got 3 entries on the access control list, which isn't really a big deal, okay? But Microsoft will tell you that you can actually do this a better way. You can minimize how many entries are on that access control list by doing something else. You can create a what's called a local group, domain local group. Let's go right here, and we're going to put DL, domain local groups. And then what you're going to do, what I can do is give permissions out to this domain local group. All right. So for example, I could give permissions. We'll say the permissions that I'm going to give is, we'll give the permissions modify. So modify. And so now if all of these New York, Dallas, and Birmingham all need modify permissions, I can now link those global groups to that domain local group, and now all three of those have been given permissions. Here's the other interesting thing. If you needed separate permissions, I could create another domain local group. All right, and this domain local group, instead of giving it modify, you could give it, let's say, read and execute permissions. Read and execute, which means they can just read data. They can't change any data. And so instead of modify, you're going to give read and execute permission this time. So it's a little less powerful, but maybe we want New York to have modify, we want Dallas to have modify, but we just want Birmingham to have, or Birmingham sales to have read and execute. All right, and of course, we're kind of looking at this on a small scale. You could imagine if you had like 20 or 30 groups that needed different rights to whatever this resource was that's on the server, you could, now that you've got these two domain local groups, you've narrowed it down just to two groups that are on that access control list. All right, it's not your domain controllers, and between your domain controllers and your servers, you're not doing as many SID lookups. You're only looking up two SIDs, which is the two domain local groups, and you could name those groups whatever you wanted. You could literally name it, modify permissions or modify on whatever the resource is. If the resource was like a sales database, I could call it modify-db, and then read-db, if you could name it based on the permissions. So Microsoft names this strategy. They'll actually call it the AGDLP strategy, okay? DLP strategy, all right, which is accounts go into global groups go into domain local groups, and domain local groups get permissions to resources, okay? AGDLP, all right, very common strategy. And if you're dealing with resources in a single domain or maybe two domains, that's fine and dandy. And this is the common strategy that's used. Now, I will tell you, as you start working on a larger scale, that's when the third group scope comes into play, which is universal groups. And so when you think about universal groups, you generally want to look at this from the perspective of multiple domains. So let's go over here and let's look at something on a larger scale. So here we've got one domain, and we're just going to copy this a few times over. We're just going to make a bigger forest environment here. All right, so we'll just draw some little trust relationships that connect everything together, like so. All right, and then we're just going to label everything real quick. So we'll just call this domain A. This will be B, and then C, D, and E. Okay. And so imagine if you had to kind of look at things on a larger scale from the perspective of, you've got these different groups of let's say salespeople. We'll just stick with the sales department for now. And you've already broken your New York sales up, Dallas sales, Birmingham sales. But what if you had salespeople in every domain? So let's say that you had a global group for every domain. You have a sales A, we'll say sales A, you have a sales B, all right, sales C. So we're going to look at this on a large scale now. That's the thing I need you to kind of get into your head. So sales C, sales D, all right, and then you've got sales E, all right. and you've got a global group for each one of these in each correct domain, whatever domain it's associated with. So we'll just put a G for global, right? So there's one of these in every single domain that has just the salespeople for that particular domain in it. Okay? So imagine you've got, and we'll just kind of map it. There it is in each consecutive domain. And then I'm kind of representing it on the right side of the screen as well for some visual purposes here. All right. And then, let's say that you have a server, right? You've got a server, and the server has some kind of a resource on it with an access control list. This is going to represent our server, okay? You've got one in, we'll say C, and you've got one in B, and you've got one in E. Now, these are servers that every salesperson in the entire company needs access to. Every salesperson in the entire company needs access to these servers. Okay. So you could do the same thing we talked about a moment ago. You could create a domain local group for each individual server that has the rights that's required. Okay, modify or read or whatever it is. So you can still follow AGDLP if you want. All right. All right. Keep in mind that domain local groups cannot travel like global groups can. Domain local groups, I like to always use the analogy, they're like cemented to the ground of a domain. Global groups can travel, they can be connected to other things in other domains, but domain local groups cannot travel. Domain local groups can contain links for objects in other domains. They themselves cannot travel. So what I could do if I wanted is, I could put each global group from sales A through E in these domain local groups and grant them permission. But here's what a universal group, this is where universal groups really shine, okay? You can create a universal group, all right? A single universal group. Put a U in there, okay, to indicate that. You can link each of these global groups inside the universal group, and the benefit is you now have a single group that represents all the salespeople in the entire company. Universal groups will replicate in every domain. So what happens is you will have a copy of this group, a replica copy in every domain in your forest. And if you make changes to it, it replicates to every domain in your forest. So every domain is going to have a copy of this universal group. As soon as it's created, it shows up in every domain. And then from there, what you're basically going to do is, like what I'm showing you over here, you're going to link each global group into each universal group. Into the universal group, the admins would do this, whatever admins, like domain A admin would do it for domain A, domain B admin would do it for domain B, so on and so forth. Now we have one group that represents every salesperson in the entire company. And so from there, I could just link the universal group to the domain local groups, and I've now granted every salesperson in the entire company, I have granted them access to that the resources that are in these servers, okay, and given them full access. All right. Now, universal groups are not something that everybody in the world is going to use, but there are some benefits to them. Keep in mind that when you put objects in universal groups, it does generate some more replication traffic. So if bandwidth is a problem, it is something to think about. But ultimately, the purpose of the universal group is to allow you to centralize a bunch of global groups that share a common need. Okay, you're centralizing a bunch of these groups into that container that are going to share a common need. All right, that should now give you an understanding of group types and group scopes. And now you're ready to jump in and start creating groups. This is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed that video, and I want you to know that I'm trying really hard to grow this channel, so I hope you'll give me a like and a subscribe. Also, if you'll check the description in this video, I've got a link for you that can show you how you can get access to all my different courses. I have lots of different Microsoft certification courses that'll help you pass your exam. All right, thanks a lot for watching the video, and I hope to see you again.